The year was 1742, on a cold autumn night in the northern colonies. The wind moved slowly through the trees, like a whisper carrying secrets no one wanted to hear. Lantern light flickered along a dirt road outside a quiet settlement near the borderlands of Colonial, Pennsylvania, and Maryland, where law and order often struggled to keep pace with the expanding frontier. A farmer traveling home late that night would later claim he saw something strange. Not a ghost, not an animal, but a wagon leaving the Whitworth estate long after midnight, covered with heavy canvas, escorted by 2 armed men carrying muskets. The horses were restless. The men said nothing. But what troubled the farmer most was the dark liquid dripping from the back of the wagon, slowly staining the road behind it. Within days, rumors began spreading across the small colonial settlements. Rumors of missing servants, rumors of secret burials, rumors that something terrible was happening behind the closed gates of the Whitworth property, a large and isolated estate that had quickly become one of the wealthiest households in the region. But in the fragile society of colonial America, wealth could silence suspicion. And the Whitworth family had a great deal of wealth. In the mid-18th century, colonial America was a land of fragile order and growing tension. The British Crown ruled from across the Atlantic. Colonial governors enforced royal laws, and communities were tightly bound by religion, reputation, and social hierarchy. A person's standing in society could mean the difference between justice and silence. Large landowners held enormous power. They controlled trade, they influenced local courts, they shaped the moral image of the community. And few families held more influence in this region than the Whitworths. Records from colonial archives describe the Whitworth estate as a sprawling plantation built in the 1730s, occupying hundreds of acres of fertile land near an important trade route connecting the Chesapeake Bay with inland settlements. The patriarch of the family was Jonathan Whitworth. To his neighbors, Whitworth was a respectable colonial gentleman. He attended church every Sunday. He donated to the local parish, served occasionally as an advisor to the county magistrate. On the surface, his life reflected the ideals of colonial society: order, faith, and prosperity. But behind the walls of the Whitworth estate, something else was growing, something that would eventually leave a trail of whispers, disappearances, and unanswered questions that historians still struggle to explain nearly 3 centuries later. Because the Whitworth family story is not simply a tale of wealth and influence, it is a story of control, of secrets, and of a disturbing pattern that began quietly, so quietly that no one recognized the danger until it was already too late. In 1741, a young man named Thomas Hale arrived in the region. Hale was not wealthy, he was not powerful, but he was educated, observant, and determined. Born to a modest family of English immigrants, Thomas Hale had recently completed his apprenticeship as a legal clerk, trained to assist colonial magistrates with records, land disputes, and court proceedings. In a world where written documentation carried enormous authority, clerks like Hale were the silent keepers of truth. They recorded debts, they recorded marriages, they recorded crimes, and sometimes, without meaning to, they recorded things powerful people would rather keep hidden. Thomas Hale had been assigned temporarily to assist the county court, copying land deeds and legal filings for several prominent landowners, including Jonathan Whitworth. At first, the assignment seemed routine. Whitworth owned several parcels of land across the region, and many colonial estates required frequent legal documentation. But Hale quickly noticed something unusual. The Whitworth family was acquiring land at an alarming rate: small farms, abandoned properties, even parcels belonging to settlers who had recently vanished or relocated. Legally, there was nothing suspicious. The documents were signed, witnessed, approved by local authorities. But Hale had an instinct that something about these transactions did not add up, and that instinct would soon lead him directly into the shadow of the Whitworth estate. The Whitworth property itself was both impressive and unsettling. Travelers described a large Georgian-style manor house standing at the center of the estate, surrounded by tobacco fields, barns, servant quarters, and dense woodland. Tall iron gates marked the entrance. Guards, an unusual sight for a private colonial estate, were sometimes posted along the road, and the Whitworth servants rarely spoke to outsiders. Colonial society depended heavily on reputation, and Jonathan Whitworth carefully maintained his image. He hosted occasional gatherings for clergy and neighboring landowners. He publicly supported the Anglican Church, Presented himself as a man of discipline, faith, and authority. But in private correspondence uncovered centuries later, some neighbors quietly admitted they did not trust him. Not entirely. They spoke of strange deliveries arriving late at night. They spoke of hired laborers who worked briefly on the estate before disappearing. They spoke of Whitworth's eldest son, Edward Whitworth, whose temper and cruelty were whispered about but rarely challenged. In a society where family honor was sacred, the Whitworth household was treated with careful respect and careful distance. For Thomas Hale, however, distance would soon become impossible. While reviewing property filings in the county records office, Hale noticed a pattern he could not ignore. Several properties recently purchased by Jonathan Whitworth had previously belonged to settlers who had no official record of departure, no migration documents, no sale notices, no court filings indicating relocation. They were simply gone. In colonial America, disappearance was not entirely uncommon. The frontier was dangerous. Illness was common. Conflicts with Native American tribes or rival settlers sometimes ended in tragedy. But these disappearances shared one disturbing detail. Each missing settler had lived within a few miles of the Whitworth estate. At first, Hale dismissed the pattern as coincidence. But the more records he reviewed, the more the pattern grew impossible to ignore. And then something even stranger appeared. In several cases, the transfer of land to Jonathan Whitworth occurred only days after the owner vanished. No probate proceedings, no estate settlements, just rapid legal acquisition, approved by the local magistrate. A magistrate who happened to be a close acquaintance of Whitworth himself. For a young clerk with little authority, this discovery was dangerous territory. Colonial society was built on fragile trust. Accusing a powerful landowner of wrongdoing without proof could destroy a career or worse. But Hale could not shake the growing sense that something deeply wrong was unfolding in the quiet countryside surrounding the Whitworth estate. And the mysterious wagon seen leaving the property late at night would soon deepen that suspicion. Because only weeks after Hale discovered the strange land records, another man disappeared. His name was Samuel Cartwright. Cartwright was a tenant farmer who had rented land near the Whitworth property for nearly a decade. He was known as a hard-working man, respected by his neighbors, and active in the local church. One morning in early November, Cartwright simply failed to appear at Sunday service. At first, no one worried. But by Tuesday, neighbors began searching his farm. His tools were still in the field. His horses remained in the barn. And inside the farmhouse, the table was set for supper as if he had expected to return home that evening. But Samuel Cartwright never did. 3 weeks later, the Whitworth estate filed legal paperwork claiming ownership of Cartwright's property. Thomas Hale now faced a choice: ignore the pattern and continue his work quietly, or begin asking questions that powerful people might not want answered. History suggests he chose the second path, and that decision would place him on a collision course with the Whitworth family whose carefully constructed image of respectability concealed something far darker. Because behind the gates of their estate, hidden beneath layers of wealth, influence, and religious reputation, a disturbing truth was slowly taking shape. A truth that would eventually shake the colonial community to its core. But uncovering that truth would require courage, patience, and a willingness to confront secrets that had been buried for generations. This is only the beginning of the Whitworth story of power, disappearance, and a mystery that historians still debate nearly 3 centuries later. Because what Thomas Hale would eventually discover inside the Whitworth estate was far more disturbing than anyone in the colony could have imagined. And once he began investigating, there would be no turning back. You're watching Liturgy of Darkness, where we uncover the hidden sins buried beneath history's sacred walls. If you enjoy deep historical mysteries, forgotten crimes, and the darker side of human history, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who loves true historical stories. Your support helps us continue uncovering the shadows that history tried to forget. And before we continue this investigation, tell us something in the comments. Do you believe powerful families in history were able to hide terrible crimes simply because of their wealth and influence? Or do you think the truth always finds a way to surface eventually? In Part 2, we will follow Thomas Hale as his investigation leads him closer to the Whitworth estate itself, where strange nighttime activity, his frightened servants, and a hidden ledger will begin revealing the first horrifying clues behind the Whitworth family's rise to power. What he uncovers there may explain why people were disappearing, and why no one in the colony dared speak about it. The Whitworth mystery is only beginning, and the deeper we go, the darker it becomes. By the winter of 1742, the quiet settlements surrounding the Whitworth estate had grown uneasy. In colonial America, fear rarely appeared openly. People did not accuse their neighbors without proof. Communities depended on fragile cooperation, shared wells, shared labor during harvest, shared defense against the dangers of the frontier. Suspicion could fracture everything. So when men disappeared, when farms quietly changed ownership, and when rumors drifted through taverns and churchyards, people did what colonial societies often did best. They looked away. But Thomas Hale could not. The colonial legal office where Hale worked was located in a modest brick courthouse in the small market town serving the surrounding countryside, built only a decade earlier. The courthouse was one of the few permanent stone structures in the region. Most homes in the area were simple wooden houses, thick timber beams, clay chimneys, small windows covered by wooden shutters. The courthouse, by contrast, stood as a symbol of British order in a land that often resisted it. Inside its dim halls, law books imported from London lined the walls. Ink-stained clerks copied legal records by hand, preserving the fragile system of colonial governance that attempted to control land, trade, and human behavior. Every contract mattered, every signature mattered, and every document could change a person's future. Hale spent long hours copying deeds by candlelight, recording the expanding influence of wealthy landowners who were rapidly transforming the countryside. But one name kept appearing again and again: Whitworth. Jonathan Whitworth's land acquisitions had begun quietly in the 1730s. When tobacco prices across the colonies were rising rapidly, tobacco was the economic engine of much of colonial America, particularly in regions tied to the Chesapeake trade. Large plantations required land, labor, and connections with British merchants who shipped crops across the Atlantic. Whitworth had all three. Shipping records suggested that Whitworth maintained profitable trade relationships with merchants in Baltimore and London. His tobacco shipments were unusually consistent, even during years when many farmers struggled with poor harvests. To outside observers, Whitworth appeared to be a shrewd businessman who had mastered the volatile colonial market. But Thomas Hale noticed something strange hidden in the legal documents. Whitworth's wealth had grown faster than his harvests could reasonably explain. The numbers simply did not align. Large estates did become profitable, but Whitworth's financial expansion seemed unnaturally rapid. And when Halley compared trade records with land acquisitions, another troubling pattern appeared. Some of Whitworth's largest purchases occurred immediately after nearby settlers disappeared. Beyond economics, the Whitworth family also held influence through the Anglican Church, which remained a powerful force in colonial society. Church attendance was not simply a matter of faith, it was a matter of public reputation. Local ministers reported moral conduct to community leaders. Church vestries managed charity, education, and even aspects of local governance. Jonathan Whitworth sat on the vestry board of the parish church. This position gave him significant authority. He helped decide how church funds were distributed. He advised on moral disputes within the community, and most importantly, he stood publicly as a defender of religious order. For a man suspected quietly of dark secrets, Whitworth maintained an almost flawless reputation in public life. Yet rumors continued. Servants occasionally left the Whitworth estate abruptly. Travelers reported strange construction activity near the property, and some claimed that Whitworth's eldest son, Edward, frequently rode into town late at night, returning before dawn with wagons that were never fully explained. But in colonial society, servants had little voice. Laborers came and went, and the wealthy rarely faced scrutiny from those beneath them. Still, Thomas Hale could not ignore the pattern growing inside the courthouse records. He began quietly copying certain documents for his own review: land deeds, trade records, probate filings, correspondence. At first, the papers revealed only small inconsistencies, dates that seemed slightly rushed, witness signatures that appeared strangely repetitive. But then, late one evening, Hale discovered something that disturbed him deeply: a letter. The letter had been filed among routine trade documents from Whitworth's estate. At first glance, it appeared to be ordinary business correspondence between Whitworth and a merchant in Baltimore. But something about it felt unusual. Several sentences contained odd phrasing. Numbers appeared where words might normally be written, and certain letters were written with slightly darker ink as if someone had pressed harder while writing them. Hale read the letter several times before realizing what he was looking at. It was coded. Hidden within the wording were sequences of letters that, when extracted, formed separate sentences. It was not a sophisticated cipher, but it was deliberate, and when Hale carefully copied the strange sequence onto another sheet of paper, the message slowly emerged. It read, "The deliveries must remain unseen. The cellar must be prepared before winter." Hale stared at the page for a long time. Deliveries. Cellar. Prepared before winter. None of these words appeared in the visible message, yet they had clearly been hidden within it. Why would a respected landowner hide such instructions? What exactly was being delivered to the Whitworth estate? Hale's curiosity soon expanded beyond documents. For the first time, he decided to observe the Whitworth property himself. The estate lay several miles outside town, along a narrow road surrounded by dense forests and rolling farmland. As Hale approached the area one evening, the scale of the property became clear. Tall wooden fences marked the estate's outer boundary. Large tobacco fields stretched across the land. Workers' cabins stood near the barns. At the center rose the Whitworth Manor itself. The house reflected the architectural ambitions of wealthy colonial families. 2 stories tall, brick construction, symmetrical windows, a large central doorway framed by carved wooden columns, but something about the structure appeared unusual. Behind the manor, partially hidden by trees, stood a new stone structure that did not match the original design. It appeared to be a separate underground cellar complex, recently constructed. Stone cellars were not uncommon in colonial estates. They were used to store food, wine, and valuable supplies during harsh winters. But this structure seemed unusually large and strangely isolated from the main house. Even more curious, lanterns burned near the structure late into the evening. Workers moved quietly around the area. Guards watched the road. For a property devoted mainly to tobacco farming, the cellar construction seemed excessive. Over the following weeks, Hale continued gathering information. Through conversations in taverns and church gatherings, he learned more about the Whitworth household. Servants rarely remained employed there for long. Laborers claimed that some parts of the estate were strictly forbidden. One former worker described hearing hammering sounds deep underground late at night. Another claimed that wagons arrived carrying sealed crates that were immediately taken below ground. But no one could say exactly what was inside. Fear kept the rumors quiet. The Whitworth family held power, and colonial communities rarely challenged powerful men unless the evidence was overwhelming. Still, Hale's investigation placed him in danger. As a clerk, he possessed access to records that many others did not. But that access also meant his work could easily be noticed. If Whitworth realized someone was examining his documents closely, Hale's career and possibly his safety would be at risk. Yet the coded letter continued to haunt him. Delivery cellar, prepared before winter. The words suggested something deliberate, something hidden, something far beyond simple farming operations. And then, one cold evening in early December, Hale uncovered the discovery that would change everything. While reviewing older estate documents, Hale noticed a small leather-bound ledger filed under Whitworth's early property records. The ledger had been placed incorrectly among routine land documents, as if someone had hidden it quickly. Inside were pages of handwritten entries, but these were not land purchases, nor trade shipments. They were names, dozens of them. Some matched settlers known to have disappeared over the past decade. Next to each name was a date. And beside several dates appeared a single, chilling word. Delivered. Hale felt the air leave his lungs. The ledger suggested something far more disturbing than land speculation. It suggested a system in which people vanished, were recorded not as deaths, not as sales, not as migrations, but as deliveries. And at the bottom of the final page was a location written in careful ink. Whitworth Cellar, South Wing. For the first time, Thomas Hale realized the terrifying possibility that the Whitworth estate was hiding something far darker than political influence or economic ambition. Something that might explain the wagons seen leaving at night. The sudden disappearances, the coded letters, and the enormous underground cellar recently constructed behind the manor. But the ledger raised an even more frightening question. If these people had truly been delivered somewhere, then what exactly was happening beneath the Whitworth estate? In Part 3, Thomas Hale will risk everything to uncover the truth hidden inside the Whitworth cellar. And what he finds there may reveal the horrifying secret behind the Whitworth family's growing power. A secret buried deep beneath the soil of colonial America. A secret that some people were willing to kill to protect. The ledger did not leave Thomas Hale's mind. For several nights after discovering it, he barely slept. The candle on his desk often burned until dawn while he reread the names written inside the small leather book. Some of them he recognized from local church rolls. Others appeared in land records tied to farms, now owned by Jonathan Whitworth. But what disturbed him most was the single word written beside many of those names. Delivered, it was not a word used in ordinary legal writing. Not in property transfers. Not in probate records. Not in any language normally used to describe the disappearance of settlers. Delivered suggested something different, something organized, something intentional. And the final note pointing to the Whitworth cellar, south wing, made the meaning even darker. Yet Holly knew one terrible truth about colonial justice. Without proof, suspicion meant nothing. And the Whitworth family had enough power to destroy anyone who accused them recklessly. So Hale kept the discovery hidden, at least for the moment. But secrets rarely remain hidden for long. The courthouse where Hale worked had many visitors. Farmers filing disputes, merchants registering cargo shipments, clergy members delivering parish records, and occasionally representatives from wealthy estates conducting legal business, including the Whitworth family. 3 days after Hale discovered the ledger, something happened that made his heart sink. Edward Whitworth walked into the courthouse. The eldest son of Jonathan Whitworth carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never faced serious consequence in his life. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and sharply dressed in a dark riding coat that contrasted with the dusty clothing of most colonial farmers. His boots struck the wooden floor with slow, deliberate steps. When Edward entered the records room, the atmosphere changed instantly. Clerks straightened their posture. Conversations faded. Even the magistrate greeted him with polite respect. Power did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it simply walked into a room and expected silence. Edward Whitworth approached the clerk's desk where Thomas Hale sat copying land deeds. For a moment, he said nothing. He simply watched. His eyes moved slowly across the documents on Hale's desk. Then he spoke. "Mr. Hale, is it?" The question sounded casual, but Hale sensed something beneath it. "Yes, sir." Edward placed a folded document on the desk. "My father requires several property filings reviewed. Nothing complicated." Hale nodded politely and accepted the paper. But as he began scanning the document, Edward remained standing there, watching, not leaving. And then Edward said something that made Hale's pulse quicken. "I understand you have been examining many of our records recently." The words were spoken calmly, but the implication was unmistakable. Someone knew, or at least suspected. Hale forced himself to remain composed. "My duties require reviewing all property filings submitted to the court, sir." Edward smiled slightly, a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Of course." Then he leaned slightly closer, his voice lowered. "Still, some matters are better left alone." The words hung quietly between them. No accusation, no threat. Just a suggestion. But Hale understood exactly what it meant. Edward Whitworth knew someone had been looking too closely, and now that someone had been warned. After Edward left the courthouse, Hale sat motionless for several minutes. The room felt colder, more watchful. He suddenly wondered how many people knew about the ledger. Had someone noticed it missing? Had someone seen him reading it? Or worse, had someone been watching him for longer than he realized? For the first time, the investigation felt dangerous, not just professionally, but personally. Over the next week, strange things began happening around Hale. Small things, subtle things, enough to unsettle him. One evening while walking home, he noticed the same rider passing along the road behind him twice. The man kept his distance, but never rode ahead. Another night, Hale returned to his small rented room near the courthouse to find the door slightly open. Nothing inside had been stolen, but several papers on his desk had been moved, including the ledger. It was still there, but no longer exactly where he had hidden it. Someone had clearly been searching and they had wanted him to know. Then came the warning. It arrived in the most unexpected place. Sunday church. The parish church was one of the few locations where nearly everyone in the community gathered regularly. Attendance was as much social obligation as spiritual devotion. That morning, Hale sat quietly near the back of the wooden chapel while the minister delivered a sermon about moral corruption and divine judgment. Jonathan Whitworth sat near the front, respected, composed, a model of colonial virtue. But as the congregation began leaving after the service, an elderly woman approached Hale briefly. She did not introduce herself. She did not speak loudly. She simply slipped a folded piece of paper into his hand. Then she walked away, waited until he returned home before opening it. Inside were only 6 words. 8. Stop looking beneath the Whitworth house. No signature, no explanation. Just the warning. The message created more questions than answers. Who had written it? Someone afraid for him? Or someone attempting to frighten him into silence? Either possibility meant the same thing. Others knew something about the Whitworth estate. They were terrified. Meanwhile, winter settled over the colony. Cold winds swept through the forests. Trade slowed along the roads. Farmers spent long nights indoors repairing tools and preparing for the coming spring. But activity around the Whitworth estate did not slow. Travelers reported wagons moving late at night more frequently now. Lanterns burned near the new cellar structure almost constantly, and workers appeared to be expanding the underground complex even further. Yet none of these changes appeared in official property records. Construction of that scale should have required documentation. Labor contracts, supply purchases, permits filed with county authorities, but no such records existed. It was as if the cellar beneath the Whitworth estate officially did not exist. Then something even stranger happened. One of the courthouse clerks fell ill. His name was Daniel Mercer. Mercer had worked beside Hale for years, copying legal filings and organizing property records. But several days after helping Hale search through older Whitworth documents, Mercer suddenly stopped coming to work. At first, people assumed it was a winter sickness. Illness spread easily in colonial towns. But when Hale visited Mercer's home, the situation felt wrong. Mercer was pale, weak, barely able to speak. The town physician claimed it was a fever. Yet Hale noticed something troubling. Mercer kept trying to say something, again and again, but each time his strength failed. Finally, Mercer managed to whisper only 3 words. Whitworth, cellar, careful. Then he lost consciousness. Mercer died the following night. The official cause was recorded simply as illness. But Hale could not ignore the timing. Mercer had helped examine Whitworth documents. Now he was dead. Fear began tightening around Hale like a slowly closing trap. Someone was watching. Someone was issuing warnings. And now someone connected to the investigation had died under mysterious circumstances. The message was clear. The Whitworth family protected their secrets at any cost. But by now, Hale had gone too far to stop. The ledger, the coded letter, the cellar construction, the disappearances. All of it pointed toward something hidden beneath the Whitworth estate, something terrible. If he walked away now, those secrets would remain buried forever. So Hale made a decision. He would see the cellar himself. On a moonless night several days later, Hale rode quietly toward the Whitworth property. Snow covered much of the ground, muffling the sound of his horse's steps. He stopped near the forest line overlooking the estate. From there, he could see the manor house dimly illuminated by lantern light. And beyond it, the cellar structure. Lanterns burned there as well, but something was different tonight. The doors were open. And several men were moving large wooden crates down a stone staircase leading underground. Even from a distance, Hale could sense the tension among them. No voices, no laughter, only quiet, urgent movement, as if they were trying to finish something before dawn. Then one of the crates shifted slightly while being carried. The lid lifted just enough for Hale to glimpse something inside. For a moment, he thought it was cloth. But then he realized it was a human hand, pale, motionless, falling briefly into the lantern light before the lid closed again. Hale's breath froze in his chest. The crates were not supplies. They were people, or at least they had been. But before Hale could process the horrifying discovery, a sound came from behind him. a branch snapping softly in the forest. He turned slowly and realized he was no longer alone. Several dark figures stood among the trees, watching him, silent, waiting. One of them stepped forward into the faint moonlight. It was Edward Whitworth, and his expression suggested this encounter had been expected. Edward spoke calmly. "You should not have come here, Mr. Hale." The men behind him began moving closer, slowly surrounding him in the snow-covered darkness. For the first time, Thomas Hale understood something terrifying. The Whitworth family had known about his investigation all along, and now there would be consequences. In the next chapter, the truth beneath the Whitworth cellar begins to emerge. But by then, escape may no longer be possible, because once someone sees what lies beneath the Whitworth estate, they rarely leave alive. The cold forest fell silent. Snow rested quietly on the branches above, absorbing every sound except the slow breath of the men standing in the darkness. Thomas Hale did not move. Neither did Edward Whitworth. For several long seconds, nothing happened. It felt like the world itself had paused. Moments earlier, Hale had been watching the cellar doors of the Whitworth estate, witnessing something that would haunt him forever: crates being carried underground, and a pale human hand slipping briefly into the lantern light. But now the danger stood much closer. Edward Whitworth had found him. The men standing behind Edward were not farm workers, were guards, armed, silent, watching. The tension in the air felt like the stillness before a thunderstorm. No one rushed forward. No one raised a weapon, because what was happening now was not yet violence. It was something more calculated, more controlled, a moment of quiet power. It's the kind that happens when two people realize that everything about their lives is about to change. Edward Whitworth stepped forward slowly, his boots pressed into the snow with deliberate calm. Up close, his face revealed very little emotion, no anger, no panic, only certainty. "You should not have come here," he repeated quietly. Hale said nothing. He understood now that every word mattered. Edward studied him for a moment before continuing. "You are an intelligent man, Mr. Hale." The compliment sounded genuine. "That is precisely why this situation disappoints me." The guards shifted slightly behind him, tightening the circle around Hale. But Edward raised a hand, and they stopped. Again, silence returned. The forest felt like a courtroom waiting for judgment. To understand this moment, we must pause. Because this was no longer simply a mystery about land records and disappearances. This moment revealed the deeper nature of the people standing in that dark forest. Two men shaped by the same colonial world, yet moving toward completely different destinies. Thomas Hale had never intended to become part of a dangerous story. He was not a soldier, not a revolutionary, not even a man with political ambition. He was a clerk. Born in 1732, a modest English immigrant family, Hale had grown up believing deeply in the fragile system of colonial justice. His father had been a small shopkeeper who respected the written word. Contracts mattered, laws mattered. To men like Hale's father, the rule of law represented the only protection ordinary people had in a society dominated by wealthy landowners. That belief shaped Thomas Hale's life. He studied hard. He apprenticed under a respected legal clerk. And he believed, perhaps naively, that truth written in ink could protect the innocent. But Hale also carried a weakness. He trusted systems. He believed that corruption could be exposed if enough evidence was gathered. Yet colonial society often worked differently. Power did not always fear truth. Sometimes power simply buried it. Still, Hale possessed one strength that many others in the colony lacked. He could not ignore injustice once he saw it, even when silence might have protected him. And that moral instinct had now brought him face to face with a man who believed in something very different. Edward Whitworth represented another side of colonial America, a side that history rarely records openly. Edward had been raised inside privilege. The Whitworth estate had given him everything: wealth, education, social influence. But it had also taught him something more dangerous: that power could shape reality. But Edward, the colony was not a fragile legal system. It was a hierarchy. At the top were families like the Whitworths, men who built estates, controlled trade, and maintained order. Below them were farmers, laborers, and servants who depended on those powerful families for survival. Edward did not see this system as corruption. He saw it as natural law. The strong guided society. The weak followed. And if certain sacrifices were required to maintain prosperity and control, then those sacrifices were simply the price of civilization. Edward truly believed this. To him, the Whitworth family was not committing crimes. They were ensuring the future of their land, their influence, their legacy. Edward looked calmly at Hale. "You are a man who values rules," he said. Hale finally spoke. "I value justice." Edward almost smiled. "Justice," he repeated thoughtfully. Then he gestured toward the distant Whitworth estate. "Everything you see there, the fields, the workers, the trade routes exist because men like my father understand what justice truly requires." Hal said nothing. Edward continued walking slowly in a circle around him. "You believe you are protecting the innocent," Edward said. "But you misunderstand the world you live in." His voice remained controlled, almost philosophical.
Ow.
"This colony survives because men with vision are willing to make difficult decisions." Edward stopped directly in front of Hale, and because other men choose not to interfere. Behind Edward, the guards remained silent. But they were not the only supporting characters in this quiet drama. Throughout the colony, many people existed in a fragile space between loyalty and fear. Servants inside the Whitworth estate. Laborers who had seen strange things but remained silent. Even local officials who quietly approved suspicious land transfers. These people were not necessarily evil. They were simply trapped inside a system where survival often required obedience. The Whitworth family understood that better than anyone. Fear could silence entire communities, especially when power controlled the courts, the church, and the economy. Edward finally spoke again. "You found the ledger, didn't you?" The question hung in the cold air. Hale felt the truth settle heavily inside him, so they knew. Perhaps they had known from the beginning, Edward continued. "You are not the first man to discover pieces of our work." That sentence revealed something chilling. Not the first, which meant there had been others. "And like those before you," Edward added quietly, "you now face a choice." The guard shifted again behind him, not threatening, just waiting. Edward's voice softened slightly. "You can return to your work in the courthouse," he said. "You can forget everything you believe you saw tonight. Your life will continue peacefully." The offer sounded almost generous, but Edward's next words revealed the truth. "Or you can continue this investigation and become another name in a ledger you were never meant to read." The forest remained silent. For a moment, Hale felt the full weight of the decision in front of him. Walk away, protect his life, or continue a path that might lead directly to his death. Edward waited patiently, because he believed he already knew the outcome. Men like Hale rarely chose martyrdom, especially when powerful families controlled the colony. But Edward had misjudged one thing: the human conscience. Hale slowly raised his head. His voice remained calm, but firm. "You said something earlier," Hale said quietly. Edward waited. "No. You said your family makes difficult decisions to protect the colony." Edward nodded slightly. "That is correct." Hale's eyes hardened. "But I saw the crates." For the first time, Edward's expression changed slightly. Just slightly. "You are not protecting the colony," Hola said. "You are feeding something." The words hung between them like a sudden crack of thunder. The guards looked uncertain for the first time. Edward remained silent. Hale continued. "And whatever is inside that cellar, it's not just your secret anymore." For a long moment, no one moved. The tension had shifted. Edward now understood something. Hale was not frightened enough to walk away, which meant the situation had changed, significantly. Edward slowly exhaled. Then he stepped back. "Very well," he said calmly. "If you insist on seeing the truth." He turned toward the distant Whitworth estate. Lantern light flickered faintly near the cellar doors. Edward gestured toward it. "Then come with us." The guards opened a narrow path through the snow. Edward looked back at Hale one final time. "But understand something, Mr. Hale." His voice was colder now. "What you are about to learn will change everything you believe about this colony, and once you know it, there will be no returning to your old life." The forest felt impossibly quiet. Hale stood there for several seconds, thinking, breathing, understanding the final weight of the moment. Then he made his decision. He stepped forward, toward the Whitworth estate, toward the cellar, toward the secret buried beneath the property, a secret powerful enough to make men disappear, a secret powerful enough to silence an entire colony. In the moment his foot touched the snowy path toward the estate, Thomas Hale crossed a line from which there would be no return. The lanterns burned low as the men approached the cellar entrance. Snow continued falling lightly across the Whitworth estate, covering the ground in quiet white layers that made the night feel strangely peaceful.
Oh.
But nothing about what was happening beneath the estate was peaceful. Edward Whitworth walked ahead without hesitation. The guards followed. Thomas Hale came last. Each step toward the stone staircase felt heavier than the last, not because Hale feared death, but because he sensed something worse. Truth. The kind of truth that could not be forgotten once seen. The entrance to the cellar was larger than Hale had expected. Heavy wooden doors stood open, revealing a wide staircase carved deep into the earth. Lanterns hung along the walls, casting long shadows that moved slowly as the cold air drifted downward. The architecture itself was strange. Most colonial estates had small storage cellars used for preserving food through winter. This was something entirely different. The stone walls were reinforced with thick beams. Multiple passageways branched deeper underground, and the construction appeared far more complex than simple storage would require. As Hale stepped inside, the smell reached him first. Not rot, not decay. Something sharper, metallic, like iron, like blood. Edward did not look back. "Keep walking," he said calmly. "I led." The staircase led into a wide chamber illuminated by several lanterns. Workers moved quietly through the space, unloading crates and carrying supplies through narrow corridors leading deeper into the underground structure. But when the workers noticed Hale, their behavior changed instantly. Some avoided eye contact, others stared briefly with a mixture of fear and pity. None spoke. That silence alone revealed how much they already understood. Edward stopped near a large wooden table placed in the center of the chamber. Maps and ledgers covered its surface. Hale immediately recognized several of the names. Settlers who had disappeared. Farmers whose properties had transferred to the Whitworth estate. Each name carefully documented. Each entry connected to the growing expansion of Whitworth land. But one detail made Hale's stomach tighten. Beside many of the names were symbols. Marks that resembled small crosses or numbers. Edward noticed Hale studying the table. "You're beginning to understand," he said. Hale looked up. "Understand what?" Edward leaned against the table calmly. "That prosperity is not an accident." Before Hale could respond, footsteps echoed from one of the tunnels. Two workers emerged carrying another crate. This time the lid shifted again, and this time Hale saw more clearly. Inside the crate was a man, bound, unconscious. Still breathing, Hale stepped forward instinctively. "What are you doing to them?" The workers froze. They looked toward Edward, waiting. Edward studied Hale carefully before answering. "You believe we are monsters?" Hale said nothing. Edward continued calmly. "But what if I told you these men are not victims of cruelty, but instruments of necessity?" Hale felt anger rising. "They are human beings." Edward nodded. "Yes, and human beings are the most valuable resource any society possesses." The words chilled the room. Edward gestured toward the tunnels branching deeper underground. "What you see here is only a small part of our work." He walked slowly across the chamber while speaking. "This colony is expanding rapidly. Trade networks grow, plantations expand. Cities demand more labor, more goods, more stability." He paused. "But prosperity requires sacrifice." Hale's voice hardened. "You're kidnapping people." Edward shook his head. "No, we are redistributing assets." For the first time, Hale understood the horrifying logic behind the Whitworth system. The disappearances, the rapid land acquisitions, the coded letters, the secret cellar. It was not random violence. It was an operation. A system designed to remove vulnerable settlers and quietly absorb their land, labor, and wealth into a growing network controlled by powerful families. Edward continued. "Some of these men become laborers elsewhere. Some disappear entirely, and some provide information that allows us to expand further." Hale stared at him. "You're building an empire." Edward's expression remained calm. "Precisely. But what Hal did not yet realize was that the Whitworth operation extended far beyond this cellar. And soon, the consequences would begin spreading across the colony itself. The following Sunday, the parish church was filled beyond capacity. Word had begun spreading quietly through the settlements. More disappearances, more unexplained land transfers, more fear. And when fear grows inside a small colonial community, people gather, they pray, they question, they whisper. The church minister, Reverend Samuel Porter, delivered a sermon that morning about corruption and divine judgment. His words carried unusual intensity. "The Lord sees what men attempt to hide," Porter declared from the pulpit. "No power on earth can conceal wickedness forever." Many members of the congregation glanced toward the front pew. Where Jonathan? Whitworth sat quietly, listening, expressionless. But the tension inside the church was only the beginning, because whispers had begun reaching the colonial magistrate as well. Farmers demanded answers about missing neighbors. Families demanded explanations for sudden land seizures. And local officials began realizing that the situation surrounding the Whitworth estate could no longer remain entirely private. Within days, a council meeting was scheduled at the courthouse. Public official, dangerous. Thomas Hale attended the meeting in silence. The room was crowded. Farmers stood along the walls. Merchants whispered near the entrance. Clergy members sat beside local officials. And at the front table sat Jonathan Whitworth himself. Calm, respectable, prepared. Edward stood beside him, watching the magistrate open the meeting with a formal statement. Recent concerns have been raised regarding property transfers and missing settlers within this district. He paused. Mr. Whitworth has agreed to address these concerns publicly. All eyes turned toward Jonathan Whitworth. The powerful landowner rose slowly. His voice was calm and confident. "My family has served this community faithfully for many years." He gestured toward the gathered crowd. "We have provided employment, supported the church, and helped stabilize trade during difficult times." Murmurs moved through the room. Then Whitworth continued. "Fortunately, the frontier remains a dangerous place. Men vanish for many reasons: illness, migration, conflict with native tribes." He spread his hands slightly. "These tragedies are not conspiracies. They are simply the realities of colonial life." Some people nodded. Others remained uncertain. But Whitworth's influence was undeniable. His explanation seemed reasonable enough for those who wanted reassurance. But one man did not remain silent. Thomas Hale stood. The room grew instantly quiet. The young clerk stepped forward slowly. He felt every eye in the building watching him. "Mr. Whitworth," Hale said carefully, "I believe there is more to these disappearances than simple frontier dangers." The statement created immediate tension. Whitworth turned toward him calmly. "And what evidence supports that belief, Mr. Hale?" Hale hesitated, because he knew what revealing the truth would mean. But he also knew something else. If he remained silent now, the Whitworth system would continue indefinitely. More settlers would disappear. More families would suffer. The colony would slowly become something darker. So Hale spoke. "I have seen the cellar beneath your estate." The room exploded with murmurs. Whitworth's expression remained perfectly composed. But Edward's eyes sharpened instantly. Hale continued. "I have seen the ledgers. I have seen the crates." The room fell silent again. Every word now carried enormous weight. The magistrate leaned forward. "Mr. Hale, are you making a formal accusation?" Hale inhaled slowly and answered, "Yes." But before the magistrate could respond, Jonathan Whitworth did something unexpected. He smiled, not nervously, not defensively. Then he spoke words that would send shockwaves through the entire colony. "Mr. Hale is correct," Whitworth said calmly. "I do have a cellar beneath my estate." The room froze. Whitworth continued. "And yes, certain individuals have been held there temporarily." Gasps spread through the crowd. But Whitworth raised his hand. "And they have been held there with the full knowledge of colonial authorities." The words struck the room like thunder. Hale felt the ground beneath his beliefs shift. Whitworth turned toward the magistrate. "Perhaps you should explain our arrangement." The magistrate's face had gone pale. Slowly, reluctantly, he spoke. "Certain operations were authorized. In the interest of maintaining order within the colony, the room erupted into chaos. because the truth had suddenly become far larger than anyone imagined. This was not just the Whitworth family. This was the system itself. And as the crowd shouted in confusion and fear, Edward Whitworth quietly looked across the room at Thomas Hale, with an expression that said only one thing. You were never fighting just one family. You were fighting the entire colony. And the true conspiracy had only just begun. For several long seconds after the magistrate's confession, no one inside the courthouse moved. The words still echoed through the wooden chamber. Authorized. In the interest of maintaining order, the meaning settled slowly over the crowd like a heavy fog. Farmers stared at one another in disbelief. Merchants whispered nervously. Even the minister standing near the doorway looked shaken. The system they trusted, the courts, the officials, the powerful men who claimed to protect the colony, had quietly permitted something terrible. Now the truth had been spoken aloud in public. Thomas Hale felt the room spinning around him. For months he had believed he was exposing a secret operation run by a single corrupt family, but now the truth felt much larger, much darker. The Whitworth estate had not been hiding from the authorities, it had been working with them. Across the room, Edward Whitworth stood perfectly still, watching, calm, almost satisfied. His father remained equally composed. Jonathan Whitworth folded his hands calmly on the table, as if the chaos unfolding around him was simply an inconvenience. Then he spoke. Gentlemen, please. His voice carried authority. Slowly, the room quieted. Whitworth looked toward the crowd. You believe you have discovered a crime, he said. But what you have discovered is something far more complicated. A farmer stepped forward angrily. You've been taking people? Whitworth did not deny it. Yes, he said simply. The room erupted again. But he raised his voice slightly. And in doing so, we have preserved the stability of this colony. The words were shocking. Yet Whitworth spoke them with calm certainty. See only individuals, he continued. But men like myself must consider the survival of the entire system. He gestured toward the farmers and merchants in the room. Trade routes, labor supply, land distribution, these are fragile structures, and when settlers fail, disappear, or abandon their obligations, someone must restore order. The logic was cold, brutal, but it was not madness. It was the ruthless reasoning of power. Thomas Hale stepped forward again. You're kidnapping your own people, he said quietly. Whitworth shook his head. No, we are preserving the colony from collapse. He leaned slightly forward. Tell me, Mr. Hale, what happens when farms fail? 8. When debts remain unpaid. When abandoned land invites chaos? Hale said nothing. Whitworth answered his own question. Disorder spreads, trade collapses, violence follows. He pointed calmly toward the courthouse window where the frontier forest stretched beyond the town. This land is not civilized yet. Civilization must be enforced. The silence that followed felt heavy, because deep down many people in the room understood the fear Whitworth described. The frontier was dangerous. Communities were fragile. Single failed harvests could ruin entire families. But the solution Whitworth offered was something else entirely. Control through disappearance, power through silence. Finally, the magistrate spoke again. His voice was weak. Mr. Whitworth, perhaps certain practices should be reconsidered. Whitworth turned toward him slowly. At risk destabilizing everything we have built. The magistrate looked away. That moment told everyone in the room a terrible truth. The colonial government had allowed the Whitworth system because it benefited from it. Land consolidated under powerful families. Labor redistributed quietly. Problems removed before they could create public panic. It was not justice, but it was effective. Yet something had changed. Thomas Hale had forced the truth into daylight, and daylight is dangerous for secrets. The crowd began arguing loudly. Some demanded investigations. Others feared that exposing the system would destroy the fragile stability Whitworth described. Fear divided the room, just as Whitworth expected. But Hale understood something important now. This battle was no longer about convincing the magistrate or arguing with Whitworth. It was about history itself. If the truth was written down, if the truth was recorded, then even powerful men could not bury it forever. So Hale did the one thing Whitworth had not expected. He pulled a folded document from his coat. The ledger. Gasps spread through the room as he placed it on the magistrate's table. These names belong to the people who disappeared, Hale said. Farmers, laborers, neighbors. He turned toward the crowd. They were not accidents. They were not frontier tragedies. They were deliveries. The word hung heavily in the air. Jonathan Whitworth stared at the ledger. For the first time since the meeting began, his expression changed slightly. Not fear, but realization. The evidence now existed outside his control, witnessed by dozens of people, impossible to erase completely. The system he built could still survive, but its secrecy had been damaged. Secrecy had always been its greatest strength. Edward Whitworth stepped forward slowly. His voice remained calm. You have accomplished something remarkable, Mr. Hale. Hale looked at him. Edward continued. You have exposed the truth. He glanced around the crowded room. But truth has consequences. The words carried a quiet warning. Because Edward understood something else. Revealing the conspiracy would not magically fix the colony. It would simply expose how deeply corruption had already spread. In the weeks that followed, the colony struggled with that reality. Public inquiries began. Some officials quietly resigned, others denied involvement. The Whitworth estate faced investigation for the first time. Parts of the cellar were sealed. Several laborers were released from hidden holding rooms beneath the estate, but many of the missing settlers were never found. Some crates had already left the property long before the truth surfaced. Their destinations remained unknown. Jonathan Whitworth himself was never formally convicted. His influence remained too strong, his allies too numerous. Instead, he withdrew quietly from public life. The estate continued operating under new management, less openly, less aggressively, but never fully disappearing, because systems built on power rarely vanish overnight. They simply evolve. Thomas Hale left the courthouse not long after the investigations began. Some people called him a hero. Others blamed him for exposing secrets that many preferred to ignore. But Hale understood something simple. History does not belong to powerful men. History belongs to those who record the truth. He spent the following years documenting what he had discovered. Letters, testimonies, fragments of evidence that survived the political storm surrounding the Whitworth scandal. Many of those documents would eventually fade into forgotten archives. But some remained. It's enough to leave historians asking questions centuries later. And the Whitworth cellar? It was eventually sealed. Stone walls collapsed intentionally to prevent further access. The entrance buried beneath layers of soil and time. The estate above it continued standing for many years before finally falling into ruin during the early 19th century. Today, only scattered foundations remain where the Whitworth Manor once stood. Travelers sometimes walk through the quiet fields without realizing what happened there, without realizing how many secrets once moved through that land under the cover of darkness. But one mystery has never been fully answered. The final pages of the Whitworth ledger contain several names marked with a different symbol. Not delivered, not crossed out, but marked with a strange symbol historians still debate today. A small circle. Beside those names, no further explanation was written, no destination recorded, no outcome described. And beneath the final page of the ledger, Thomas Hale himself had written one last note before sealing the document into the archives. It read, "The cellar beneath Whitworth's house contained more than prisoners. Some chambers remained locked even after the estate was searched. Whatever was kept there was never officially recorded. History is filled with stories about power, about faith, about corruption hidden behind respectable faces. The Whitworth family was not unique in those struggles, but their story reminds us how easily authority can justify terrible actions when stability becomes more important than justice, and how fragile truth can be when powerful people control the systems meant to protect it. Yet truth has one strange habit. It refuses to remain buried forever. Sometimes it waits decades, sometimes centuries, but eventually, someone begins asking questions. Someone finds the ledger. Someone opens the door. I just witnessed the story of the Whitworth family. A story of ambition, silence, and the dangerous belief that power can replace accountability. But one question still lingers beneath the ruins of that forgotten estate. A question that historians still cannot fully answer. Even now, even after everything that has been uncovered. And perhaps that question matters more than all the others.